Good day. As I make this video, the United States and China seem to be in the process of what might be described as a second Anchorage moment. Anchorage was, of course, the city in Alaska where the Chinese and the Americans faced off against each other back in April, and where the Chinese delegation, headed by two members of the Chinese Politburo, steamrolled over US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who came along to that meeting in Anchorage, apparently with a long list of Chinese transgressions that he wanted to speak to the Chinese about, and who also sought to lecture China about the various merits of the United States and its role in the world, and about the rules-based international order that the United States has been so busy promoting recently. I did a program about the Anchorage summit at the time it was taking place, and of course it has been much talked about and discussed subsequently by many others. Well, as I said, we seem to be going through something rather similar at the moment. And it ought to be said, however, that it is being conducted at a somewhat lower level this time, in the sense that Antony Blinken is not actually going to be at this meeting, which is taking place in Tianjin, a city in northeast China, not far, by the way, from Beijing. But the US delegation is led by Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman. Now, before I discuss this program in further detail, I'd like to say a few things about Wendy Sherman, and I'm not saying these things critically, but I think it is actually interesting to look at the background of the sort of people who nowadays tend to represent the United States in foreign negotiations, to get a sense of how US policy is made and how the US political and government system works. Firstly, it should be said that I've read certain comments in certain places which imply that Wendy Sherman is a career diplomat. Now, a career diplomat in Europe would be a full-time, permanent civil service type official who works in the foreign ministry of the country that he or she is representing, and who has actually received proper professional training as a diplomat, and who has served in a variety of diplomatic posts, reaching back to lower positions in embassies, and then as ambassadors, and then as deputy foreign ministers and heads of department in the nation's foreign ministry, until they eventually rise to the point where they are able to conduct, or are entrusted to conduct, negotiations on behalf of their countries. Now, that was the practice in Britain and France and other Western countries at one time, to rely a lot on people like this, and you will still find them from time to time representing their countries, their European countries, in negotiations. However, it's fair to say that in Western Europe, this tradition is increasingly lapsing, and you find that increasingly negotiations are taking place or are being conducted not by professional diplomats of that nature, but rather by people who come from the political class, people who are appointed to senior diplomatic positions because they are members of the ruling party. And Wendy Sherman falls exactly into that category. Now, she started life as a social worker. I've no doubt she was exceptionally good at that. She's also done work at places like Fannie Mae, where she was at one time head of their foundation. She's also done academic work, but her role, her work as a diplomat has always been as a result of being appointed to senior diplomatic posts as during periods of democratic administrations. And in fact, if you look at her background very carefully, what you discover is that Wendy Sherman is somebody who very much belongs to the Clinton faction, if you like to call it that, of the Democratic Party. And she is someone who has risen as a result of political patronage from the Clintons in much the same way that Secretary of State Blinken has risen to his current post as a result of being a long-standing protege of the current President of the United States, Joe Biden, and is in fact a client, if you like, of Joe Biden, who appointed him to the office of Secretary of State when he became president. And in fact, you find that Wendy Sherman first held senior diplomatic positions when the Clintons were in office in the 1990s. She was then brought back into government by Hillary Clinton during the period when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and she had Wendy Sherman working for her at that time. And now that the Democrats are once more the administration of the United States, you find that Wendy Sherman has returned, obviously, in a position of senior position as Deputy Secretary of State, and no doubt as part of the balancing act that takes place in the Democratic Party when posts are allocated and the various factions that make out the Democratic Party have to be appeased through judicious use of patronage. Now, I want to stress again, I'm not saying any criticism, not making any kind of criticism of Wendy Sherman specifically, but there is nothing about her background that shows any particular expertise or knowledge of China or about how the Chinese political system works. No doubt in some of her academic work, she's had to deal with China there, but I suspect that her knowledge and experience of China is very superficial and is hardly of a sort that would qualify her as an expert, as somebody familiar with China and the way the Chinese system works, and with familiar with the kind of people whom she will be up against when she goes to Tianjin. And that is important because though the West is increasingly no longer using true professional and career diplomats, the Russians and the Chinese do. The kind of people that they set up in meetings are real career professionals. And of course, what that means increasingly is that the Americans and the Western powers, when they go to head with the Chinese and the Russians, are sending amateurs to score against professionals. Now, that can work sometimes if the amateur is exceptionally gifted, but as anybody who's had experience of that sort of thing knows, generally it doesn't work very well. Anyway, enough about Wendy Sherman, but I think I wanted to make that observation simply because it does provide some insight into the nature of US foreign policy and the way it is conducted. Why is Wendy Sherman going to China now? Why has she gone to China after that debacle in Anchorage in order to meet the Chinese on their own home territory, where she will be up against Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and his officials? What is the purpose of this visit? Well, helpfully, the State Department has provided us with a briefing, and it's a briefing by two anonymous officials. Perhaps one of them is Antony Blinken himself, though one can't obviously be sure. And there's a lengthy discussion in the State Department website, a lengthy transcript which sets out the kind of briefing that these two officials gave to the US media in advance of the talks. And it's very interesting to read this. I'm not going to read it in full. As I said, it's very long. But the essential point is that the United States now finds itself in a situation where the relationship with China has become all important and all encompassing. And at some levels, this relationship with China has become confrontational, and at other points it's become adversarial. But sometimes the United States and China can collaborate and work with each other on items of mutual interest. And anyway, it is important when dealing with a country like China, a country as powerful as China, to keep communications open. Now, all of that sounds very good and very wise and very realistic. But I would say that it is actually, when one thinks about it, rather unorthodox diplomacy. Because what it basically says is, well, the Chinese are actually very bad people. They are our adversaries, our enemies, if you will. But we have to deal with them, and that's why we're talking to them. And sometimes, when it's in our own interests and to our own advantage, we can get the Chinese to agree to things that benefit us, even if they might not necessarily benefit them. So it is very much, if you like, diplomacy a la carte. We will deal with the Chinese, and we will do so in our own interests, not necessarily in China's. And even as the Chinese work with us on some issues, we can be horrid to them in others. I'm being a little bit sarcastic there, but that is the essence of it. Now, that is not traditional diplomacy. Traditional diplomacy is that you send your ambassador or your foreign minister or your senior diplomat to meet the ambassadors, foreign ministers, senior diplomats of other countries, obviously in order to conduct a dialogue with those countries, obviously in order to learn what are the intentions and purposes of those countries, but also ultimately to improve relations with these countries. There is no actual reference anywhere in this transcript to any desire on the part of the United States to improve relations with China. It is, as I said, purely a la carte. We have decided that the Chinese are our adversary, our rival. We are in competition with them. We are in confrontation with them. They are our adversary. But from time to time, when it suits us, we will talk to them to see if we can get them to agree to what we want on some specific question, like, for example, climate change. Now, I have to say, this is not only unorthodox diplomacy, it is, again, the kind of diplomacy you would associate with an amateur. It is an attempt to have your cake, as we say in England, and to eat it as well. To be able to say that the other side is your enemy and your rival, and that they're hostile to yourself, but at the same time to think that you can use them as you wish to your own benefit. It was very much like something that A.J.P. Taylor, the British historian, once said about Western attitudes towards Russia. You treat Russia like a tap, which you can turn on and off whenever you please, and that essentially sums up the attitude of the United States towards China at this moment. They think they can turn China off as a tap whenever they please on issues like climate change, but they can turn that tap off again and on again as they want. And unsurprisingly, it's not a policy that is working very well. And there was perhaps one of the strangest moments in this particular meeting between the two anonymous officials and the media, in which the two anonymous officials were actually asked by a member of the media, to provide an example of when this policy has actually worked, when it has actually produced any sort of actual benefit, when it has succeeded in providing or causing China to change its behavior, to moderate its behavior, to start behaving rather more like the United States might want to behave. And it's actually very interesting to read up this exchange, and I'm now going to do so. So, question. Good morning. So my question is, in the last 6 months, you've taken a range of actions towards China. You've also done an awful lot with allies, particularly in Asia, also in Europe. Can you point to a few examples where you think US policy towards China has actually caused China to do things differently over the last 6 months? And the reply from senior administration official 2 is as follows. So, I'm happy to point to a couple of things, Dimitri, and thanks for the question. I mean, number one is, as you rightly note, a huge part of our emphasis on our approach to China is working with allies and partners. And I think there's a few things I would note as context before getting to the second part of your question. I think a lot of our effort is really aimed at shaping the international environment around China, on building resilience among allies and partners to Beijing's coercive and actions that are at odds with our collective interests and values, and ensuring, as we said, that we can present an affirmative vision. One of the things, though, I think that we've really seen is that these multilateral actions have really gotten Beijing's attention, and in some cases, I think has actually caused Beijing in many ways to take steps that actually are potentially counter to its own interests, where we saw Beijing impose its own counter-sanctions on European officials, European parliamentarians, and after the multilateral actions imposed some Xinjiang sanctions back in March. That certainly has given some pause to certain quarters in Europe about things like the comprehensive agreement on investment. I think there's other areas where we've also seen Beijing take some pretty assertive steps when we have acted in concert with allies and partners. And I think it's a demonstration of the fact that those multilateral actions really get Beijing's attention. And so I think it is really that broad upholding of international norms and rules and principles, as well as the shaping of the international environment around China, that is really, again, having the potential, I think, in the long term to influence Beijing's actions. So I think that basically reflective of the approach that we are taking and some of the ways I see that playing out. Now, trying to unpack this incredibly long-winded answer is that no, we can't think of any single instance where the kind of pressures and approach we've taken to China has made China in any way more accommodating to us. It's not helped our relations with China in any way. All that we have managed to do is to provoke the Chinese into taking more assertive steps against us and our allies also. Well, that is very strange diplomacy. The intention is not to improve relations, not to ease tensions. It is, if one is to believe this comment, intended to aggravate tensions, to goad the Chinese into taking assertive actions against us, which we can then use as part of our media and political strategy in order to embarrass and isolate the Chinese. Well, I mean, it's bizarre thinking, it's very, very weird thinking to actually make your partner, the country you are in at present in contact with, make them more angry and aggravated with yourself in order to achieve, well, what precisely? It's not entirely clear. We have instead all the usual guff about, that I think it is really that broad upholding of international law norms and rules and principles, as well as the shaping of the international environment around China, that is really, again, having the potential, I think, in the long term to influence Beijing's actions. Well, I don't entirely understand what that last sentence means, but the intention seems to be, to the extent that I can understand it, to try to isolate and contain China with a view eventually in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, to coerce China into changing or modifying its behavior in a way that suits the United States. That perhaps is a strategy that is based upon a misunderstanding of US strategy with the Soviet Union and then Russia during the Cold War. It's a myth, by the way, that the United States pursued that kind of policy towards the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. There were long periods, successful periods, when the United States actually sought and achieved genuine better relations with Moscow, and those provided an important backdrop to the Cold War, but it seems to be based to some extent on some misunderstanding or misconceived view about the effects of containment with respect to the Soviet Union. But anyway, China is, of course, not the Soviet Union, and it's very unclear that containment can possibly work against China, which is a very much larger country in terms of population, which has an economy whose manufacturing capacity exceeds that of the US's own, and which is, of course, anyway, a civilizational state. So it is a strange foreign policy to follow, and, dare I say it, not a very coherent one. And again, the kind of thinking that one might associate principally with an amateur, somebody who doesn't really understand foreign policy very well, who doesn't strategize very well, who sees things very much in the way that somebody who thinks of diplomacy as a board game might try to play it. Anyway, that's the Americans. What are the Chinese saying? Well, instead of all that guff, we have clear and straightforward and blunt language. And this is the Global Times report from the first day of the meeting. And I'm going to read this one in full because it's reasonably short and to the point, and it discusses the kind of comments the Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Xie Feng said during the first meeting, the first encounter with Wendy Sherman in Tianjin. And as you will see, the tone and the force of language and the clarity is very different. Anyway, this is the Global Times report. The fundamental reason for the deadlock in China-US relations is that some in the US always see China as an imaginary enemy, Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Xie Feng said during a meeting with US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman on Monday morning, urging the US to change its misguided mindset toward China and its extremely risky China policy. Xie met with the US envoy in North China's Tianjin municipality amid increasingly tense bilateral ties, fueled recently by the US's moves of imposing sanctions on several Chinese officials over Hong Kong and its groundless accusation that China is engaging in cyber attacks. China has delivered 2 lists of major concerns to the US during Xie's meeting with Sherman. In the lists, China asked the US to unconditionally lift the visa restrictions on members of the Communist Party of China and their families, as well as on Chinese students, and to stop suppressing Chinese companies and hindering the development of Confucius institutes. The US should stop labeling Chinese media as foreign missions and revoke the extradition of Meng Wanzhou. Meng Wanzhou is, of course, the chief financial officer of Huawei, who was arrested in Canada and deported by Canada to the United States, where she's currently being held in detention. Anyway, continuing with the Global Times report. Some people in the US have been bringing up the so-called Pearl Harbor moment and Sputnik moment in reference to the China-US conflicts. The aim of such metaphors is to demonize China as the imaginary enemy, to divert Americans' attention away from their dissatisfactions with domestic politics, economy, and society. Washington has been trying to contain China, thinking that will solve its problems, as if the only way for the United States to become great again is to contain China's development. Xie also pointed out that the Chinese people can see that the US claimed competition, cooperation, and confrontation policies are nothing but cover-ups for exerting pressure on China. Confrontation and containment are the fundamentals. Cooperation is for expedience, and competition is a trap of discourse. When the US needs China, cooperation is required. In area where China has advantages, they cut off supply chains and impose sanctions, Xie said. He went on to say that in order to suppress China, the US will not hesitate to start conflicts, to settle whatever the US wants to settle, and to get whatever the US intends to have. It has been seeking unilateral benefits all along. How can there be such a rule where one does all the bad deeds but take all the benefits? The so-called rules-based international order put forward by the US is a disguise that packages rules set up by a few Western countries. It is the US version of the law of the jungle, where it abandons the widely accepted international law and tramples on the international system so that it can profit and bully others. In talking about human rights issues, Xie said that the US should handle its own problems first before finger-pointing at others. The United States has no right to claim it's the representative of democracy and human rights when it has committed genocide against its own indigenous people, left a death toll of over 620,000 people from an ineffective pandemic response, and provoked wars globally using lies and military force. So there we go. A very, very different type of comment from China. Now, some in the United States will shrug and say that this is all some sort of a rant, but of course it isn't. It is, in fact, a pointed reminder to the United States that containing China is a fool's errand. The Chinese can see right through this, and they will not be treated as a partner to be worked with a la carte, where you get the Chinese to agree with you on matters of your own interest and are horrid to China about everything else, including those things that hurt and embarrass China specifically. And the Chinese are not going to mince their words about saying it. China is interested in a genuine improvement of relations with the United States. And of course, and as I said, that is the usual, conventional, orthodox, if you will, purpose of diplomacy, but it will not be dealt with a la carte in the kind of way that the United States chooses, with the US left to pick and choose those issues which benefit itself, but which do not benefit China, and to communicate with China on those, but to disregard all the rest. And I would add that Xie's comments about the rules-based international order are the most trenchant that I've seen a Chinese diplomat make, And here we see a comment about how the rules-based international order is a package of rules set up by a few Western countries which tramples upon international law and the international system. I did a whole program on the topic of the difference between the international law and the rules-based international order for this channel, and you can look it up if you wish. And I've also pointed out that the Russians have been very forthright in criticizing the whole concept of a rules-based international order, and now the Chinese are speaking in the same forceful language that the Russians have adopted and have been using for some time. And so what the Chinese are essentially telling the United States is that if you think you can talk to us in the kind of way that you are proposing, coming along and speaking to us and lecturing at us, and at the same time wanting to have our help on issues that concern you, but feel that you can disregard our own interests, well, that's not going to happen. We are a great country, a superpower. We have an economy bigger than yours. We have armed forces that are growing in size and power every day. We are a civilizational state with a history of 5,000 years. Either you deal with us in a straightforward way, seeking improved relations with us, or you will find our relationship continuing to go south and becoming purely adversarial as China adapts to the measures that you are taking and comes to see the United States as a purely hostile power. And that seems to be the approach the Chinese are going to take and are going to continue to take. And notice the way that Xie Feng made the point that the US policy towards China is based upon a misguided mindset and is extremely risky. In other words, it contains risks for the United States because it is opening up the United States to a situation where it finds that it has miscalculated totally and finds that the Chinese, far from wanting to deal with the United States in the way that the United States wants, are going to start taking unilateral actions. One of those, conceivably, could be over the question of Taiwan, which is never far below the surface in terms of Chinese foreign policy. Others could be in relation to the issues of the South China Sea. And it's striking that on the eve of this meeting in Tianjin between the Chinese and Wendy Sherman, the Chinese did two other things. Firstly, they imposed counter-sanctions on US officials, reminding the US that China can also play the game of sanctions if it's pushed into doing it. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it's published articles warning Britain not to send its warships within 12 kilometers of the Chinese coastline. And the Chinese coastline, of course, includes Chinese islands and Chinese artificial islands, such as China has been building in the South China Sea. The Chinese have watched very closely the action the Russians took in the Black Sea with respect to HMS Defender, the British destroyer that was unwise enough to sail too close to the Crimea, and as a result got buzzed by Russian aircraft and was basically escorted out of Russian seas by Russian gunboats. Chinese media has covered that episode extensively, and there's talk in China that just as the Russians are saying that if the British or anyone else comes too close to Russian territorial waters and has any wild ambitions about what they might want to do there, just as the Russians have said that they would be prepared to take military action to defend their territory, which includes their territorial waters. The Chinese are hinting at the same. Now, I cannot imagine anything that could escalate tensions more than a situation where the Chinese were to attack a British warship or conceivably even an American warship close to their own borders. That would increase the level of international tension to unheard of levels, but the Chinese are now giving warnings that they are prepared to do that. And here we see Xie Feng warning the United States that its approach of seeking confrontation with China is an extremely risky one. Now, we will see how these discussions between the United States and China, between Wendy Sherman and the Chinese, go. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, is also part of these talks, and perhaps ultimately things will start to calm down and we will start to see things begin to take a perhaps more conciliatory direction. In spite of what I said about Wendy Sherman at the beginning of this program, I do not question that she is an intelligent person, and perhaps having listened to what the Chinese have to say and listened to the force of their response, maybe she will go back to Washington and report back to the administration that this policy that is being pursued towards China is not a wise one. I think the United States needs to consider very carefully where its relationship with China is going. I think there are certain issues where the United States has fully legitimate and proper grounds to speak with China on a very tough basis. I think it is true that over the last 30 years, especially the last 20 years, the Chinese have been able to take advantage of certain US economic and geopolitical policies to build up their own economy at the expense of the United States. And I am prepared to accept that there was a lengthy period when the Chinese did indeed take considerable technology from the United States, some of it by covert means, and that some of it has ended up in China and has been used effectively, very effectively, by the Chinese there. And I can fully understand and fully accept that the United States would want to discuss with China the way in which to correct that. And there are other things that the United States can do. I've discussed in various programs that I've done how the United States can legitimately express concerns about the Chinese naval buildup in the Pacific, which is now, as I said in a recent program, not only challenging the United States in the seas and oceans and waters close to the Chinese mainland, but which look increasingly as if they are projecting Chinese power into the Central Pacific. The United States has legitimate issues to bring up with China over that. And I've also discussed how the United States could, as part of some kind of overall deal with China, agree with the Chinese and perhaps the Russians limitations on naval construction and naval deployments. I think all of that would be part of a sensible and workable package, one which defends American interests, protects American red lines, takes a realistic approach to the conduct of foreign policy with a country like China, and which is based on no illusions about China and what China is. After all, the Chinese are tough-minded, hard-headed, practical and realistic people. And I think talked to in that way, they would probably understand and work with the United States about what a way to achieve some kind of effective compromises on this issue. And cyberspace also is another area where it seems to me the United States and China, and indeed the United States and Russia, could probably also come to agreements also in a way in order to contain and moderate and regulate the competition that takes place between each of them in the field of cyberspace. But all of this must be done within an overarching objective of improving relations. In other words, you say to the Chinese, you come to the Chinese and you say to the Chinese, look, these are our concerns. Let's see how we can address them. And then as part of addressing our concerns, we will see what we can do to address your concerns where we consider those to be legitimate. And ultimately, our objective is to have better relations between our two countries in our mutual interest. That is conventional, orthodox, wise diplomacy as it is normally conducted. But that is not what the United States is doing. What the United States is doing is saying to the Chinese, you are terrible people, we don't like you, we see you as our adversary, we see you as our enemy, but from time to time we may need your help on certain matters important to us, and we would like you to help us when those sorts of situations arise. That's what the United States is currently saying to China. That is what it is saying to Russia. Both of those countries are offended, understandably, by that kind of language, and they refuse to be played in that way. And the result is that instead of relations improving and international peace and security becoming firmer, the situation is spiraling downward and getting steadily worse. And as Xie Feng correctly said, that approach is extremely risky. This is not realism. I think that there are some people in the United States who believe that it is. This is not a realistic way to conduct the foreign policy of a great power, or indeed of a superpower, such as the United States is. It is, as I said, the foreign policy approach of an amateur. It treats foreign policy, again, as a board game. International diplomacy where you win spaces and move around your counters and do the odd deal here and there, but in fact have no real intention of following through, because every deal that you do is entirely intended to benefit you and is not aimed at setting up some sort of international system which everybody can work with. And by the way, the same goes for the approach towards this rules-based international order. It is a concept created by an amateur. It's not really a system that can ever work, because a system which, as Xie Feng correctly said, and as I discussed in that recent video, a system which is created to benefit you exclusively is not going to be accepted by other powers, especially not a powerful country like China, which has its own interests and its own opinions, and which has the means and the power to exert its influence around the world. So what the United States needs to do is to start to be realistic about its policies, its relations with China, as well as its relations with Russia. And it should do that in order to buy itself that time and space that it needs in order to sort out its own pressing domestic problems. And here again, Xie Feng perhaps used language that is not the kind of language I would use, and perhaps language which does not recognize the very profound and true strengths of the United States. But when he talked about the United States pursuing an aggressive foreign policy in order to divert Americans' attention away from their dissatisfactions with domestic politics, economy, and society, well, he is on to a point. As a professional diplomat, he is probably a lot more familiar and understanding of the domestic realities of the United States than I suspect Wendy Sherman and Antony Blinken and all the others are about the domestic politics of China. Well, thank you for joining me for this long video. I suspect there will be more programs shortly about this very interesting summit meeting in Tianjin. I suspect that it will end badly with relations between China and the United States taking another spiral downward, but we shall see. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me for future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also check us out on our other channels, on our other platforms, I should say, BitChute, SuperU, and Locals, and the rest. And we have various plans for those channels, which you'll be seeing and which will be unveiled shortly and over time. And please also support us to the extent that you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. And lastly, don't forget to go to our shop, buy the amazing things you will find there. There are some brilliant new hats that Alex has supplemented our store with. But there's also, of course, T-shirts and hoodies and polo shirts and sweatshirts and other amazing things in our shop too. And last but not least, please remember to press the like button to this video if you've actually liked the video, and please also check your subscription to this channel. And perhaps if you've actually liked this video, may I suggest that you share it with your friends too. Thank you very much for joining me today. And again, I look forward to you joining me again, and have a wonderful day in the meantime.